It started as these things often do, not with a bang, but with a beige envelope slid across a polished table. Inside was the clinical language of severance, the corporate euphemisms for obsolescence. Restructuring, efficiency improvements, alignment with future strategies. But I knew what it meant. After 22 years, for months and 11 days at Omnicorp Solutions, they were replacing me, Jasper Thorne, age 54, with an algorithm. My boss, David Chin, a man I'd mentored when he was a fresh-faced intern, a man whose wedding I'd attended, couldn't quite meet my eye. Beside him sat Eleanor Vance from Human Resources, her expression a careful blend of sympathy and corporate detachment. The date was October 17, 2024. A Thursday. I remember the weak afternoon sunlight filtering through the blinds, catching the dust motes dancing in the air, indifferent witnesses to the dismantling of my professional life. David mumbled something about market pressures and the unavoidable march of technology. He mentioned the Athena initiative, the new AI system designed to manage the intricate network of legacy databases I'd curated, maintained, and practically breathed life into for over 2 decades. Athena, they assured me, could do my job faster, cheaper, and without the need for pesky things like vacation time or healthcare benefits. They offered the standard package, a few months' salary, some outplacement services I wouldn't use. It was presented as generous. To me, it felt like tossing loose change at a beggar after stealing his coat in winter. The irony wasn't lost on me. My domain, the labyrinthine Project Nightingale, was a patchwork quilt of systems dating back to the late 90s, integrated and coaxed into modern functionality through years of my dedicated effort. It held the company's historical data, the bedrock of their analytics. And they thought a piece of software, however sophisticated, could simply step in? I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Years of navigating corporate politics had taught me the futility of emotional displays in such moments. I simply nodded, asked a few clarifying questions about the transition timeline and the return of company property, and maintained a composure that seemed to unsettle them more than any outburst would have. They wanted me gone quickly, quietly. A 2-week handover period, they said, though they barely expected me to use it. They thought the AI was already shadowing my functions, learning. They thought I was redundant. In that sterile conference room, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, a cold certainty settled in my gut. They had made a colossal error, blinded by the siren song of buzzwords and cost savings. And they would eventually realize it. Because there was something they didn't know, something they hadn't accounted for in their shiny projections and algorithms. Something only I had. My journey with Omnicorp began in the summer of 2002. George W. Bush was president, the dot-com bubble had well and truly burst, and I was a hopeful 32-year-old technician eager to make my mark. Omnicorp wasn't the sprawling entity it is today, it was a mid-sized firm with ambitious plans. I started in general IT support, fixing printers and untangling network cables. But I had a knack for the older systems, the ones others found arcane and frustrating. While my colleagues chased the newest certifications, I found myself drawn to the company's core database infrastructure, Project Nightingale. It wasn't glamorous. Nightingale was a beast, cobbled together over years through acquisitions and shifting technological landscapes. It ran on a mix of outdated hardware and heavily customized software, documented sparsely, if at all. Management saw it as a necessary evil, the digital equivalent of a dusty attic full of vital records. But I saw its importance. I saw the patterns, the potential points of failure, the elegant, if archaic, logic holding it all together. I volunteered to take ownership, spending countless evenings and weekends tracing undocumented code, reverse engineering processes, and meticulously creating diagrams and procedural notes. My life became intertwined with Omnicorp. I met my late wife, Clara, through a company social event. We bought our first house 15 minutes from the office. When our daughter, Emily, was born, my colleagues threw me a surprise baby shower. Omnicorp wasn't just a job, it was the scaffold upon which I'd built my adult life. Loyalty wasn't just a concept, it was woven into the fabric of my days. I remember one specific crisis in 2009, the Cascade failure incident. A power surge during a thunderstorm bypassed our primary backups and corrupted a critical Nightingale subsystem. Panic ensued. Financial reporting ground to a halt. The IT director at the time, a decent man named Frank Miller, was beside himself. Everyone was scrambling, pointing fingers. I stayed for 72 hours straight, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, painstakingly rebuilding data indices from fragmented logs and obscure recovery points I'd discovered and documented just in case. Clara brought me changes of clothes and sandwiches. On the third day, bleary-eyed but triumphant, I restored full functionality. Frank recommended me for a special commendation and a significant raise. It wasn't just about the technical skill, it was about the dedication, the willingness to go above and beyond. Over the years, I saw management teams come and go, strategies shift, buzzwords change. But Nightingale remained, and so did I, its steadfast guardian. I wasn't flashy. I didn't crave the executive track. I found satisfaction in the quiet competence of keeping the company's historical heart beating reliably. My performance reviews were consistently excellent. Phrases like dependable, meticulous, possesses unique institutional knowledge were staples. I trained new hires, including David Chin, sharing my knowledge patiently. I believed in the company, in the work. I believed my dedication meant something, that it built equity beyond the paycheck. I was stable, reliable Jasper, the guy you called when the really complex, really old stuff broke down. The guy who just understood Nightingale. The shift began subtly, almost imperceptibly, around 18 months before my termination. It started with the arrival of Arthur Vance, a high-priced management consultant whose tailored suits and slick presentations promised radical transformation. His remit was operational optimization through technological integration. Vance spoke a different language: synergies, disruption, AI-driven paradigms. He held endless meetings, asking probing questions about workflows, always with an underlying assumption that human processes were inherently inefficient. He seemed particularly interested in Nightingale, but his questions weren't about its function, they were about its cost, its maintenance overhead, the possibility of automating its management. I answered his questions honestly, explaining the system's complexities, the nuances that required human oversight, the potential risks of premature automation. He'd listen with a polite, fixed smile, nodding while his eyes seemed to glaze over, already formulating his report. Around the same time, David Chin, my boss, started acting differently. Our regular one-on-one meetings became shorter, more perfunctory. He avoided eye contact more often, peppering conversations with Vance's buzzwords. He asked me to document my core daily, weekly, and monthly tasks in excruciating detail under the guise of knowledge sharing and backup. I complied, providing comprehensive documentation of standard operating procedures, but a prickle of unease began. Why the sudden, intense focus on codifying my specific role? Then came the emails about the Athena initiative. Initially vague, they spoke of leveraging AI to enhance data analysis and streamline back-end processes. There were mandatory training sessions on new data governance protocols, seemingly designed to facilitate machine learning access. I noticed unusual activity in the system logs, extensive data scraping operations running during off-peak hours originating from IP addresses associated with the new AI development team. They were feeding Athena, teaching it to recognize the patterns within Nightingale's data structures, likely mirroring my routine checks and maintenance tasks. Colleagues grew quiet around me. The easy camaraderie in the break room felt strained. Questions about my weekend plans were met with fleeting glances and mumbled replies. People knew something was happening, or at least suspected. The whispers stopped when I approached. It was isolating. I felt like a ghost haunting hallways I'd walked for decades. The most concrete red flag came about 3 months before the end. An email from HR, CCNG David requested copies of all system documentation I had personally created for Nightingale, citing a need for a centralized knowledge repository. This was unusual. My documentation was always stored on the shared network drive accessible to relevant teams. They specifically asked for any supplementary notes or personal guides. I uploaded the standard official documentation, procedures, flowcharts, basic troubleshooting guides. But my truly indispensable notes, the ones detailing the system's deepest quirks, the undocumented hardware handshakes, the recovery steps for obscure error codes I deciphered through years of trial and error, the ones compiled in my personal dog-eared binder, those I kept separate. They weren't official company property in the strictest sense. They were my working notes, my accumulated wisdom, filled with annotations, diagrams copied from long-lost manuals, and handwritten observations. Digitizing them fully had always been on my to-do list, but the sheer complexity and the mix of formats made it a low priority compared to keeping Nightingale running. I responded politely to HR, confirming the official documentation was uploaded and available. The suspicion wasn't a sudden revelation, it was a slow dawning dread, a gradual cooling of the atmosphere, a series of small signs that, taken together, painted a clear picture. They weren't just optimizing, they were planning my exit. The final meeting on October 17th was almost an anticlimax. The decision had clearly been made long before. David stammered through his script. Eleanor Vance offered pamphlets for services I didn't need. The mention of the Athena initiative as my replacement confirmed everything. They believed their AI was ready. They believed I was now just a legacy cost. I packed my personal belongings that afternoon, the photos of Clara and Emily, a chipped coffee mug, a few industry awards, and tucked discreetly into my briefcase alongside my notebooks and pens was the binder. My Nightingale binder. It wasn't company property, it contained no proprietary code owned by Omnicorp, but rather my analysis, annotations of publicly available or vendor-supplied information, much of which the company had likely lost track of, and procedures I had personally developed to navigate the system's undocumented eccentricities. It was essentially my professional journal for the past 2 decades focused on that specific system. Letting them digitize that felt like letting them digitize my brain, and something instinctive told me to keep it close. I walked out of Omnicorp Solutions for the last time, not with anger, but with a strange sense of calm clarity. The betrayal stung, yes, deeply. 22 years erased by an algorithm and a consultant's report. But panic wasn't productive. Strategy was. That evening, instead of wallowing, I opened my laptop. I created a secure, encrypted folder. I started documenting everything I could remember from the past 18 months. Dates of specific meetings with Vance and David. Summaries of conversations. Copies of emails regarding the knowledge-sharing requests and the Athena initiative. I cross-referenced system logs I'd routinely backed up, part of my standard, approved process, showing the AI team's data scraping activities. I noted down the names of colleagues who had acted strangely, potential witnesses to the changing atmosphere. I scanned key pages from my Nightingale binder, not all of it, just enough representative samples to potentially demonstrate the unique, undocumented knowledge it contained, carefully watermarking them as personal working notes. The next morning, Friday, October 18th, I contacted Sarah Jenkins, an employment lawyer recommended by a former colleague who had gone through a similar restructuring. We met the following Monday. I laid out the timeline, the documentation, the veiled pressure, the abrupt termination, and the AI replacement. I explained my age, my long tenure, my consistent performance reviews, and the sudden shift after Vance's arrival. Sarah listened intently. She agreed it smelled strongly of age discrimination masked as technological progress. The fact they replaced me directly with an AI rather than eliminating the role entirely or hiring a younger human was a potential point of leverage. But the most crucial element she recognized immediately was the binder. This, she said, tapping the thick, worn cover, this is your leverage, Jasper. not just for a potential wrongful termination suit, but for what comes next. Our strategy wasn't immediate litigation. It was patience. Sarah advised me to focus on meticulously organizing my evidence, securing digital copies, and preparing a formal response to the severance offer, rejecting it, and outlining our concerns regarding potential discrimination. We would wait. Omnicorp believed they had seamlessly transitioned my responsibilities to Athena. They believed Nightingale was now under efficient, automated control. My prediction, based on intimate knowledge of the system's fragility and undocumented complexities, was that this belief was fundamentally flawed. Athena could handle the routine, the predictable. But Nightingale was full of ghosts, legacy code quirks, and hardware nearing obsolescence. It wasn't a matter of if something would go wrong that the AI couldn't handle, but when. And when it did, they wouldn't have the map through the minefield. Because that map wasn't on their servers. It was in my briefcase and, more importantly, in my head, synthesized over 22 years. We prepared the rejection letter, sent it via registered mail, and then we waited. I started exploring freelance consulting options, updating my resume, reaching out to contacts. Life had to move on. But in the back of my mind, the ticking clock wasn't mine, it was Omnicorp's. The call came 6 weeks later. Late November, just before Thanksgiving. The caller ID showed Omnicorp's main number. It wasn't David or HR. It was Mark Harrison, the current Chief Technology Officer, a man I'd only interacted with briefly in large meetings. His voice was tight, strained. "Jasper," he began, dispensing with pleasantries, "we have a situation with Nightingale." I kept my voice neutral, calm. "Oh? What sort of situation, Mark?" He hesitated. "There's an anomaly. A data corruption issue in the archival logs cascading into the retrieval functions. Athena can't seem to isolate the root cause and the standard rollback procedures aren't working. It's impacting quarter-end reporting preparation." I could almost hear the rising panic behind his forced composure. This wasn't a minor glitch. This sounded like one of Nightingale's classic, obscure failure modes, likely triggered by an interaction Athena wasn't programmed to anticipate, maybe a specific sequence of queries combined with a hardware hiccup on one of the older servers. "That sounds challenging," I replied evenly. "Have you tried rebuilding the tertiary indices from the sector backups?" There was a pause. The tertiary indices? Athena's diagnostics didn't flag those. Our current documentation doesn't detail that procedure. Of course, it didn't. That procedure, involving specific low-level disk commands and manual cross-referencing of pre-corruption checksums, was detailed on page 117 of my binder, complete with handwritten notes on dealing with potential read errors from the aging drive arrays. "Ah," I said. "Yes, it's a non-standard recovery technique for certain types of logical corruption, quite specific to Nightingale's older architecture." Another pause, longer this time. Harrison cleared his throat. "Jasper, David mentioned you kept extensive personal notes on the system. Is it possible this procedure is detailed in them?" "Bingo. I do have comprehensive personal documentation compiled over my 22 years working with Nightingale, Mark," I confirmed. "It covers many non-standard procedures and undocumented system behaviors." "Right," Harrison said quickly. "Look, we obviously need that information. Omnicorp is prepared to compensate you fairly for access to your documentation and perhaps some consulting time to guide our team." This was the moment. I took a slow breath. "Mark, my relationship with Omnicorp ended on October 17th. Any discussion about accessing my personal work product or engaging my services would need to go through my legal counsel, Sarah Jenkins. I'm sure you understand." I gave him Sarah's contact information. His curt "understood" before hanging up told me everything I needed to know. The ball was in their court, precisely where Sarah and I wanted it. Sarah handled the negotiations. Omnicorp, desperate to fix Nightingale before the end of the financial quarter, was highly motivated. Their initial offers were insulting attempts to buy the binder outright for a nominal fee. Sarah countered firmly, framing it not as selling notes, but as high-level consulting based on unique, irreplaceable expertise contingent on settling the wrongful termination claim. The binder was the key that unlocked the solution, but the knowledge to apply it was mine. We didn't demand reinstatement. I had no desire to return. We focused on tangible restitution. The negotiations took about 10 days. Omnicorp's lawyers tried bluster, then pleading. Sarah held firm, armed with my evidence of potential discrimination and the undeniable fact that their multi-million-dollar Athena initiative was useless without my obsolete knowledge. In the end, they capitulated. The settlement, finalized on December 5, 2024, was substantial. It included a significantly enhanced severance payment, effectively covering several years' salary. It included damages acknowledging the circumstances of my termination. It included a formal, written apology from the CEO acknowledging my decades of service and the value of my contributions. And crucially, it included a separate, extremely generous consulting contract. Under this contract, I agreed to provide 10 hours of remote support, specifically guiding their internal team, not Athena, through the necessary recovery procedures using information derived from my notes. I never handed over the binder itself. I provided specific, targeted instructions via video conference, screen sharing selected, heavily watermarked diagrams, and procedural steps from its pages, ensuring they fixed the immediate problem but didn't gain the full repository of knowledge. My hourly rate for those 10 hours? Let's just say it reflected the unique value proposition and their desperation. David Chan was not on those calls. I heard through the grapevine he was reassigned shortly after. Arthur Vance's consultancy contract was reportedly not renewed. Athena, I learned later, required significant reprogramming and ongoing human oversight, negating much of its projected cost savings. They hadn't just replaced me, they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the system I managed and the value of embedded human experience. The settlement funds arrived shortly before Christmas. It wasn't just money. It was vindication. It was the quiet, satisfying click of the universe acknowledging that 22 years of dedication couldn't be dismissed by a spreadsheet. Seeing Omnicorp, the giant corporation that deemed me obsolete, forced to come back, hat in hand, admitting they needed my personal notes. There was a profound, if quiet, satisfaction in that. It wasn't about revenge in the fiery sense. It was about the restoration of balance, about competence being recognized, even belatedly. I never set foot in Omnicorp again. The apology letter sits filed away, a necessary part of the closure, but not something I dwell on. The real closure came from moving forward. With the settlement funds providing a comfortable cushion, I didn't rush into another corporate job. Instead, I took time to reflect, reconnect with Emily, who was now in college, and figure out my next chapter. The experience crystallized something for me. My deep, specialized knowledge, the kind Omnicorp undervalued, was actually a rare and marketable asset in a world rushing towards generic automation. Legacy systems weren't glamorous, but they were everywhere, underpinning critical functions in countless organizations. And many companies were facing the same challenge: how to manage, maintain, or migrate these complex systems when the institutional knowledge resided in the heads of long-serving employees who were often nearing retirement or, like me, being pushed out. In early 2025, I established Thorn Legacy Systems Consulting. My niche is precisely what Omnicorp discarded: providing expertise in managing, documenting, and developing migration strategies for aging but essential IT infrastructure. My Nightingale binder became the template for the meticulous documentation process I now implement for clients. Business has been surprisingly good. Companies realize that while AI is powerful, it can't replicate decades of hands-on experience with quirky, undocumented systems. They need people who understand the why behind the what, people who can bridge the gap between old code and new technology. There's a certain irony in leveraging the very skills that led to my dismissal to build a successful new venture. My life is different now, quieter in some ways but more fulfilling. I set my own hours. I choose my clients. The stress is different, the pressure of running my own business, but not the soul-crushing weight of feeling undervalued or disposable. Looking back, the betrayal by Omnicorp was a painful catalyst, a forced redirection. But it led me here, to a place of independence and renewed purpose. They thought they could replace human experience with an algorithm, save costs, and streamline operations. They learned, expensively, that some things like deep-seated knowledge, meticulous care, and the ability to troubleshoot the truly unexpected don't have a software patch. They needed the manual, yes, but more than that, they needed the understanding that only came with it, the understanding they had carelessly discarded. And in the end, I wasn't just vindicated, I was liberated.